and welcome to our third unit of Baroque art, where we will begin with Italy. We'll discuss some Spanish Baroque art, and then head into the golden age of the Netherlands, of this Dutch Baroque art. Okay, so we discussed the Protestant Reformation in our last unit, and even though we're going to primarily look at the 17th century here, this art is essentially all based upon the Protestant Reformation. And so it spreads like wildfire. There are many issues with the corruption of the Catholic Church at this time period. The printing press enables for these ideas to be able to spread across Europe. People have access to the Bible for the first time in their own language. They printed copies. So this really makes a huge movement. It results in many people turning away from the Catholic Church. And there's a lot more criticism against the Catholic Church. And the church first ignores this, but then they see this is spreading, that it's legitimate. And so they have the Council of Trent. And this was various meetings between 1545 and 1563, and where they discuss many of the issues that the Protestants had been bringing up. Some of which they use to reform corruption within the church, which is great. They acknowledge these corrupt practices, etc. But I want to focus on the decisions made about art. So Protestantism really hones in on the idea of the Second Commandment, which is, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or likeness." Essentially, it's saying that not to use icons as a form of worship, to not see these as, let me back up, like when it comes to many of the images that we saw, like if you were praying to a saint or you were praying to Mary, your intention was for that to get to Jesus essentially, but the Protestants saw this as a worshiping of idols, and they saw images of these other people or even images of Christ, etc., as being a form of idolatry. And so we even have examples of iconoclasm, a big one in 1566 in the Netherlands. We see this throughout history. We see it across the globe, even in present day. I'm sure there's one happening right now, where you destroy these images to destroy the power of them. And so with this Protestant Reformation, we destroy many of these Christian images in the name of them being, or trying to reduce idolatry. So unfortunately, much of the art from before now is lost. But what the Catholic Church decides is they reject this idea of Protestant iconoclasm, and they insist that images in religious worship are necessary to teach devotion. So come back to the reality that the majority of our population is illiterate. They may be printing the Bible and people may be able to access it, but they can't, the majority of the population can't read it. And so these images help to communicate these stories, these ideas, these lessons. So Catholicism stands on the ground that these images are an important part of understanding Christianity, of worship and devotion. And so what we see here is Baroque art essentially being an example of this. So I want to come back to the Last Judgment. So we used Michelangelo's fresco painting behind the altarpiece when we were discussing the Renaissance, briefly with mannerism, and I want to hone on in its Counter-Reformation aspects. So the Counter-Reformation is again where the Catholic Church is countering all the Protestant Reformation ideas, and they're really going to push art in this regard, and they're going to push art as a reminder of, well, in this case, of what would happen if you don't adhere to the Catholic Church, with this idea of the Last Judgment, of Christ judging at the end of days, and where you will either go to heaven, up in the top portion of the picture plane, or you will go to hell, particularly in the bottom right, where we see these people suffering. And so to communicate this authority of the church that still stands, is we're depicting the Last Judgment. It's this idea of communicating these images, of pulling people back. And this is 1536, so we still have the Council of Trent meeting, etc., and we're going to see how they take a different route rather than just this idea of judgment and almost a threatening notion throughout this painting. So we see these people being pulled down into hell and the great suffering. And so this image is this reminder of the church's authority, and don't be swayed by these new ideas to come back to Catholicism. But of course, common sense tells us that this isn't really the best approach when you have, when you're trying to counteract a very popular form of art. So with our Italian Baroque art, what we start to see is this idea of bringing the people back to the Catholic Church in like a more embracing way. Before I go into that a little bit more, here's our simplified timeline, where we have the Renaissance, 16th century, 1517, the Protestant Reformation begins. 1533 is we see the beginnings of this Reformation. They're reacting against Protestantism. Some argue it's the end of the Renaissance. I tend to disagree. It's the age of exploration, where all these major countries in Europe are exploring the globe, etc. We have the first modern atlas published. And then we're going to look at the 17th century in Baroque art. And I'm generalizing with the dates here. So we're back into Italy. And what? Sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Going with a different train of thought now that I'm here. And so where I was talking about this shift of the Counter-Reformation art being more of an embracement of people coming back to Catholicism, of encouraging them to trust back or put their faith back into Catholicism, I want to use Bernini's Piazza Colonnade. And this was completed in 1675. So this is our key sculptor of the Renaissance. So notice how I say sculptor, yet here he is also an architect. So one of those other examples of these incredible artistic geniuses that can work in multiple mediums. And so the argument is that this arch form, we have this colonnade coming out, is it symbolic of the arms of the Catholic Church reaching out to welcome its communicants. So it's this idea of embracing people back into the Catholic Church. Instead of this threatening stance that we had just looked at with the Last Judgment, instead it's about embracing them. We're going to see this focus of themes of redemption and an emphasis on normal everyday people and the common people. And so this helps to communicate some of these ideas. Also, consider with the Renaissance, we saw this idea of balance and symmetry, etc. And one of the differences in just shapes, even with Baroque art, is we have this oval, or ellipses, rather than like circles, etc. And this perfect symmetry that we're seeing with the Renaissance. So again, of reaching out, of welcoming people back to Catholicism. And so let's talk about Bernini and use him as a means of discussing some of these attributes and characteristics of Baroque art. So first of all, Baroque supposedly comes from the Spanish word irregular pearl. It's irregularly shaped. So we don't have the same, again, with these characteristics of symmetry and balance, etc., that we saw with our early and high Renaissance, where this artwork is not symmetrical. It's still balanced somehow, but it's not symmetrical. And what we really see is emotion. Okay, so we started to see that a little bit with our high Renaissance, especially in the depictions of the body. But now we're seeing that even more in the facial characteristics here. And so notice like this emphasis on line, of movement. And what we're seeing is a much more dramatic representation of David here. So consider this early Renaissance David, high Renaissance David, and then our Baroque David. And I'll give you a moment to just glance with the differences between these artworks. Okay, so let's consider the differences in the time of the story in which these are. So our early Renaissance depicts David after the battle, victorious. Here's Goliath's head. That's Donatello. Here's Michelangelo's David, where it's right. He's focusing on his opponent. It's before he throws his slingshot. Now, what's going on with Bernini's David here? So here we are mid-throw. Here is the action of the throw. Here is the movement, the focus, the determination, realistic stance of the body in which he's twisting his arm back to pick up this momentum to fling the slingshot and the rock forward. So here is Bernini, the sculptor that we were just looking at. Later we'll get to Caravaggio, but just FYI, right from the beginning, I want you to think, when you think of the Italian Baroque, I want you to think of Bernini as our main sculptor, Caravaggio as our main painter. Sorry, my dog. So some elements of Baroque art is you're uniting art and spectacle. And so these are super dramatic. They're really theatrical. There's going to be this real sense of movement. It really takes place in Italy. There's several other popular styles during the 17th century, but we're going to be focusing on Baroque, which again may come from the Spanish term Baroquio, of irregular shaped pearl, which consider it's more irregular versus the Renaissance. So there's this real sense of complexity, of drama, versus the precise, orderly rationality of the classical models we were looking at with the early and high Renaissance. And so they create these dynamic paintings and sculptures, this real sense of theatricality, this elaborate ornamentation. They're much larger in general than the artworks that we saw in the previous couple units. They're grandiose in scale, they're really spectacular. Yeah, and it's essentially an example of a Reformation, where these are purposefully meant to bring people back to the Catholic Church. That is their aim. They're patronized by the Catholic Church. So it's this intention of restoring Catholicism, dominance, and centrality in Christianity. So let's compare some images that we've already seen again. So here's our painting of Caravaggio. But we looked at Fra Lippi, okay? And we have Madonna with Child. We looked at Leonardo, Madonna of the Rocks. And here we're looking at Caravaggio's version. And consider just how different this is. So, what's not present in Caravaggio's? Well, A, we don't have a background. Okay, we have this extreme tenebrism, which I'll go over later, don't worry, where the focus is on the people. Now, I want you to take a moment and really look at these people and acknowledge the differences between Caravaggio's people and his figure style versus Leonardo and Lippi's. So look at how they're not necessarily idealized. Here we have St. Anne, okay, same St. Anne, and she looks old, right? These figures even look dirty. They're not idealized, but they're also extremely realistic. These look like real people. Okay? This child looks like a real child versus the other, compared to Fra Lippi, etc. So we're going to see those elements play out within our Baroque art as well. So there it is up close. So another term I want to introduce is we looked at modeling in light and dark, and what we see here is chiaroscuro, is this sharp contrast, but also tenebrism. And so this tenebrism is where the background is completely black, essentially, and the focus is only on the individuals. Okay. Now consider the spotlight effect of all this. Let's come back to our images of Madonna with Child, of Mary with her child. And here's the theatricality behind this. Imagine that there was a spotlight on a stage. This is what it would look like with Caravaggio's. Okay, it's this dramatic lighting, dramatic facial expressions, dramatic poses, dramatic scenes. It's much more theatrical than our previous styles. And here's our tenebrism with our background that's ambiguous. It almost seems blacked out with this intentional bright spotlight on these figures. So those were by Caravaggio. Here's an example again of how the architecture differentiates between, or is different than our previous units. Look at these spiral columns instead of just our straight, very Greco-Roman columns. They still have Greco elements. We still see classical elements, but just not to the strict adherence that we saw with our High Renaissance. These curving columns help us to define the differences between the straight and orderly of the Renaissance and the drama of the Baroque period. So these were by Bernini. It's in St. Peter's Basilica, above where it's believed that St. Peter's tomb resides. Okay, so let's talk about Bernini some more. So here's Gian Lorenzo Bernini's David, our Italian Baroque. Here he is. If I could go back in time and meet any artist, it would be Bernini. 17th century Italian Baroque and ancient Greek and Roman art were my specialties for my master's degree in art history, so I love this unit. It's hard for me to condense it. So Bernini was an architect, a sculptor, a playwright, and a stage designer. So here's where we really see the theatricality and the drama of the stage. Here's who helps define the Baroque period. He's one of the most imaginative artists of the Baroque period, and his first major patron was a pope, Pope Urban VIII. He spent so much money on the arts that he nearly bankrupted the Vatican treasury. Again, in this attempt to bring people back to the church and communicating through art, and as well as just lavishly spending. He makes marble look flexible and soft. We're going to see this theme of time, pronounced movement. Yeah. He knew the Renaissance status of the hero, and he plays off of that, where he himself becomes, this elevated artist. And so here's our David, where it's extremely dramatic. Consider just his pose, where he's not standing in the contrapposto pose that we saw so frequently before. Instead, he's in this twisting motion. It's ornate, it's decorative, there's this emotion that's intended to draw the viewers into the artwork. They want you to be a part of it. You are encouraged to walk around this because of the twisting action. You acknowledge that no matter where you look at it, you aren't getting the full picture. So engages the viewer. You want to walk around it to see it all. And so we talked about how this is a different part of the story that he's depicting rather than after or before. He's in this pivotal moment where he's reaching back and where he's about to let loose this stone from his slingshot. What we also see below him is this armor that was offered to him by King Saul, but he rejected it because he had full faith in the Lord to bring his rock where it needed to go. And so there's that element of faith, of that trust. So he's bringing in this other element of the story. But it's this violent pivoting motion. And so if we were doing a formal analysis over this, I would focus on line and how this curved line of his body is so different compared to the more rectilinear that we saw with our previous Davids, and how he uses line to show this drama of the body. It requires space around him. And so the viewer is thinking about time as you see this. You can picture right before, you can picture this moment, and you can picture after. We're technically only seeing the moment in which he's throwing them, where he's about to fire off this rock. But in our heads, we see the whole storyline before us. So somehow he's able to incorporate time within this singular statue. Here's another angle. So consider how realistic this body looks. It's not just idealized, looking like these Greek gods that we saw at the High Renaissance. This looks like an extremely realistic body. So yes, you could argue it's idealized, but it's not overly exaggerated. It looks realistic. And again, y'all, this is marble. It's stone. It looks like a real body. So this violent pivoting motion that will launch his stone. The certain muscles that are flexed, the position of his body, even the muscles engaged in his leg, etc. You can tell where he spent a significant amount of time really studying what a body would look like in this picture. We can imagine a model which he's sketching before and determining how to depict it. And let's check out his face. So think back to David's face by Michelangelo and how there was this sense of determination. He was standing there considering his opponent. But here we see this much more dramatic sense of focus, where his eyebrows are furrowed. It looks realistic. He's also even biting his lip in this moment of focus. His hair also looks pretty natural. So the argument is that this is actually pretty much a self-portrait of Bernini, that he was looking at a mirror and constantly furrowing his brows and biting his lips in order to determine exactly how to portray this specific facial expression in stone. So we can see some of those elements here. So it's just so realistic and individualized, where this looks like a real person, an individual, rather than just your generic Greek gods that we were seeing before. Compare to these two. Lack of expression in the face, generic face, not individualized, contrapposto pose, classical, versus Bernini. This theme of time. There's the difference in the facial expressions and the faces in general. So here's some other examples. I mean, this is the bust. He was Louis the 14th of France. The King of France was a patron of him, where he commissioned him to create this self-portrait. Consider the movement of the drapery. I mean, this looks like it is billowing in the wind, yet it is marble. And the lace of the collar, the hair, the individualized face. So Pope Clement X was his next patron. And what's funny is also numerous other clergymen, the bust of Cardinal Scipione Borghese. So he became extremely popular, of course, and he developed a pretty good relationship with Cardinal Scipione Borghese, and to where he had commissioned him to create this portrait, and Bernini was working, and as he was working, he came to this part in the marble when he was pretty much done, and there was this crack along the forehead, just natural part of the stone. And he was such a prolific artist and so skilled that when Cardinal Scipione Borghese came to see the finished product, Bernini brought this one out. And he was visibly disappointed by this crack right across the forehead. And then right after that, he brought out his other one. So in the amount of time in which it would take most artists to create one single stone portrait, Bernini was able to produce two. So it was he brought out the final version without any of these natural imperfections. But let's consider, I mean, look how realistic this looks. It's an individualized face. It looks like who this person truly was. And look at how he's able to depict even like the goatee, his clothing. It's just incredibly realistic. So I really like this one, the Rape of Persephone. It's not Persephone, sorry, the correct one's on your handout. I always want to say Persephone, but that's not it. And so it's this Greek myth, back to Ovid, think back to the Metamorphoses that we saw with our Botticelli artwork, and where essentially this nymph is running off, and this Greek god's about to take her, and she cries out to her father to save her. But here we have where I want you to consider right here, on the thigh, on the side of her body, and look how he has made stone look like flesh. It's right above here. I mean, he looks like he's gripping an actual thigh. But again, this is stone, this is marble that he has carved out. So essentially this right here makes me appreciate Bernini and is my key argument for why he is the best sculptor ever to exist. I know many would argue Michelangelo is, but I'm going to stick to Bernini. You can consider the muscles and the veins and the realistic depiction of so many different textures, but especially how he makes stone look like flesh. So talented. Here's another one, Apollo and Daphne. She's running, she turns into a tree after crying out to her father. Persephone, she had to spend eternity in below. Anyway. Okay, so there we have Bernini. The best. But I'm biased. Okay, so here is an example of architecture that differs from our Renaissance. So he wants to, in Borromini, he wants to embody this Baroque style. And so we have classical elements. We have our columns that we've seen. We have our other elements that look very classical in nature. But consider the little differences with this alternating concave and convex bays throughout. With this undulating, this more circular and elliptical and oval shapes that we see within this architecture is different. There's this much more dramatic play of light and shadow. So even consider how we saw that with Bernini's artworks. So there's this added sense of drama. Sculptures, the interior, in this more oval shape, all these decorative elements. It's more dramatic. Okay, and back to Bernini, our Ecstasy of St. Teresa, from the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria, but in the Cornaro Chapel. So remember when we were talking about the Merode altarpiece and how we saw the patrons within the work of art? Here we have members of the Cornaro family around this work of art. And they patronize this altar, this chapel within this church. So here we have this story of St. Teresa. Again, think back to our Reformation, where they argue that images are a source of devotion to communicate these stories. And so with Catholicism, they also incorporate saints within Christianity, and that these saints are a means of communicating, overcoming certain obstacles. You may have, like we talked about with St. Margaret, the saint of childbirth, or various other reasons, but where they are in this elevated status. And so we have the story of St. Teresa. Within the Cornaro family chapel, and here they are on either side. So a position of power, especially within Italy, in our papal states. If you wanted to show your powerful status of your family, you likely had many family members in the church, high up, cardinals, etc., to help illustrate your power. And so here we have members of the Cornaro family, even extended family members, where they're depicted here. So let's consider, look at how he has made stone look like pillows, and like this undulating drapery, how it overlaps the architecture, yet that this is all stone, and this is all architectural elements, and this these high relief sculptures of these gentlemen behind this low relief background, which looks extremely three-dimensional. We still have our classical elements, of course, but this real sense of realism and drama. Each of these individuals are individualized. They look like specific people. The positions of their body help to illustrate, this movement, and of course this skill. And so they're witnessing this event where St. Teresa has with this angel on the other side, other members of the family. And so with St. Teresa, there was this scene where essentially an angel came to her and pierced her heart with this arrow, where she felt this ecstasy of God. And so we see that depicted here, where she, this cloud-like structure. But this clothing looks extremely realistic. The facial expressions, it's dramatic. Even this lighting behind her, let me back up, sorry. This gold coming down helps to highlight this area. Above it was a small window Now when you're there, you can put a couple cents into this little machine that turns on a light above, and then you can see it glimmer and shine off of this gold, which helps to highlight this area. Like so. So it draws your attention to this area. Okay, and heading on to Caravaggio. So we looked at our Italian Baroque sculptor. Let's talk about our Italian Baroque painter. At the Calling of St. Matthew. And so again, we have this tenebrism. So that's extreme chiaroscuro, where the background is almost ambiguous. It's almost completely black. And consider the theatricality of this piece, and especially when it comes to light and this sense of a spotlight. It's not necessarily a realistic sense of life, where we really see, it seems like from theater stage lighting, where it's shining down upon these figures. And he does that intentionally. We definitely analyze light and dark and who's highlighted here. And so this is the story of the Calling of St. Matthew, where Jesus called upon the tax collector, one of the most hated individuals, even today, no one likes paying their taxes, to follow him. So here he is. Here's Christ. But is Christ highlighted? No, he's in the shadow. We essentially only see his hand highlighted. Instead, these individuals are highlighted. So I want you to take a moment and consider how the depiction of these individuals differ from the Renaissance. Okay, so a couple key points. A, they are of various ages, right? This younger boy, older gentleman, middle, etc. They're also in contemporary clothing. So they are in 17th century clothing. They also look extremely realistic. Okay? And they're set inside a dirty, grungy tavern. Okay, consider this older gentleman doesn't look idealized. None of them look idealized. They look like the people who would be viewing this painting. So here's our key understanding of this patronage of the Catholic Church to create Counter-Reformation art, which helps to define the Baroque period in Italy. This painting is massive. So when you walk up to it, these figures are almost life-size. Not quite, but they're large. They're also right up against the picture plane. They're dressed in the same outfits that you are. They look like normal people. They don't look individualized. And they look like in this grungy little tavern in which you would enter. And then look at this as well. There's this open side to this table. So you yourself are a part of the scene. You are engaged as the viewer. Instead of showing these noble, super idealized individuals, they're showing ordinary people just like you and me. Where the ordinary viewers, the majority of the population, can identify with the figures in this image. They look like them. They're doing the same things that they would, etc. And that they were called upon by Christ to join Christianity, to join him, to listen to his message. So they're bringing this, these messages of Christianity onto a much more realistic level, where you see yourself within this image, where you are invited to the table, where you're invited to join Christianity. That's why these figures are highlighted rather than the focus being on Christ. It's inviting you back to Catholicism. That even, no matter what you've done, even the most hated of society are called upon by Christ to join him, or welcomed back. Okay. Was first known as Levi. He changed his name. This hand you may recognize looks just like a creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel. So Caravaggio is showing off who he studied, what he studied. He has this minor halo entering from the right. And so this looks extremely naturalistic. Not only realistic, it's naturalistic. This sacred story from the Bible is brought into a contemporary setting with contemporary people. Okay, so they're non-idealized. We have this incorporation of tenebrism, this ambiguous setting. It's dark, etc. the Italians have been influenced by the Northern Renaissance extreme attention to detail. But this beam of light to join God. And then we have a lot of followers where he creates, he becomes this prolific artist in which many want to copy. And so we have Vagistes who copy his style. But again, there's this theme of welcoming back into the church, as well as conversion, where he is converting to Christianity. So this idea of you converting to or back to Catholicism. Of St. Matthew. Again, so they're life-size, the viewer's up against the picture plane, contemporary dress, contemporary setting, just like you, of all ages. No one's idealized here. And here's Caravaggio. So Caravaggio is like the early version of the rock star, where he would get into like bar fights and drunkenness. At one point he had murdered someone. He was brought to court many times. So art historians and modern people love the story of Caravaggio. He was this 17th century Italian rock star. Here are some of his other artworks. Boy with a Basket. So this was most likely his lover. So there's this sense of sensuality. We'll start to see the rise of still lifes, especially when we get to the Northern Baroque period. We're showing all these different textures, and then it'll also have additional meanings, of course, with our Northern Renaissance. But I want to show the crucifixion of St. Peter as another example of the Reformation art. And so here we have St. Peter, one of Jesus' followers, the leader, the first of the church, the first pope. And where he is to be crucified, and he asks instead to be crucified upside down, because he doesn't think he's on the level to be crucified in the same way as Christ. And so here we have the action, the time, the movement, just like the other scene where it was this sense of time, where we could imagine the before and after, just like here. The theatricality of it, the tenebrism, the dark background with this spotlight. But what's different about this one? None of these figures are idealized. St. Peter looks old. He looks like a realistic person. And also, consider the lighting of how our attention is drawn toward this guy's rear end, and especially his dirty feet. Showing your feet like to someone else is even today it's gross, but it was especially disrespectful during this time period. And you, the viewer, are right up against this picture plane, so you're getting a real view of this gentleman's backside and his really dirty feet. As well, St. Peter has like dirty hands and feet, and these other individuals look like they've obviously been working, etc. Things look rough. And so he's showing these realistic images. They don't look idealized. They are dirty. The viewer can identify with this hard work that these individuals are doing, with the age of St. Peter, etc. And so this was controversial as well, with showing these images, as people hadn't seen this dirtiness in scenes of the Bible, etc. And here is Judith beheading Holofernes. So this is an Old Testament story. But this is also one of the stories that was taken out of, so Catholicism has a few additional books compared to what the Protestant Bible has. The Protestants chose to take those books out. And so part of a Reformation is that the Catholic art is going to be showing these specific stories, which Protestantism rejected and didn't include within these new Bibles they're producing. So here we have one. Essentially, it's the story of Judith, where she was, some argue she was somewhat of a prostitute, or at least her actions show that. And then her city was under siege. And she goes to the general, this prolific general, Holofernes, and she gets him drunk, tries to seduce him, and she ends up beheading him and saving her town. So here we have Judith beheading Holofernes. Here is our Baroque realism of these realistic figures. Consider the wrinkles and the age of her maidservant. the blood splurting, the realistic humans, the individualized humans, the drama, the sense of time where we're, blood splurting mid-moment. Here's the death of the Virgin. So this caused some controversy. Again, he was like this rebellious rock star. But he shows here's Mary has passed on. And so here, people around her. But it came out that he had modeled this, like sketched out and done in the likeness of a body that was found to have drowned in the river. And it was the body of a prostitute. So he's showing Mary with the body of this bloated body of a prostitute that had drowned in the river. So that created some controversy. Like I said, the rebellious rock star of the 17th century. Caravaggio, The Taking of Christ, after Judas kissed his cheek. Though some argue this is more done by Caravaggisti, wannabe. St. Jerome. Age not idealized. He looks elderly. Okay, so I want to use the Judith beheading Holofernes to talk about Artemisia Gentileschi, a female painter. Though with timing, we'll pick up with this tomorrow.